Hi, this is Glenn Loury at bloggingheads.tv and Brown University, and I'm very happy to be talking with Jeff Madrick, who's going to introduce himself now. Jeff?
Well, thanks for inviting me to do this, Glenn. I'm director of the Schwartz Rediscovering Government Initiative at the Century Foundation. I edit a 40-year-old magazine called Challenge, which I think Glenn is familiar with.
I know it very well.
Been editing. Yeah, I haven't been editing it for 40 years, in case you were wondering. I write regularly for the New York Review of Books and other publications. I clearly wear a lot of hats. I teach at Cooper Union, and I write books, and then we're talking about the latest book called 7 Bad Ideas, How Mainstream Economists Damaged America and the World. It's published by Alfred Knopf, out this fall.
Indeed, so, a significant book, a provocative book, especially for someone like me who's a professional economist. Challenge magazine, I can remember, you say 40 years. I was an undergraduate. Well, I was a graduate student 40 years ago, but I somehow have this recollection of Challenge magazine being this rich resource for reporting about matters economics that could be used for pedagogic purposes, especially for people at elementary stage of their economics education.
I think it still is.
Yeah.
Not merely elementary, but beyond that, it's still used, I think, as a pedagogical tool. I think its main audience is professors and libraries at universities. And they're always calling me up for free copies of articles.
I guess that's what magazines have to do if they want to stay afloat these days.
I don't know. I try to resist it, and say we do have to make $5 here. So.
Oh wait,
anyway,
that's an economics point.
Yeah.
Okay, so 7 Bad Ideas, Jeff. You're an astute observer of the economic scene and of the economics profession. You've been writing about this for decades. Why don't we get started by you just summarizing, a little bit about, what these bad ideas are and how it is that they do damage to America and the world. And then I can try to see if I can effectively defend my profession against your
I'm sure you'll be quite effective. But let me tell you first why I decided to write this book.
Yeah.
First, major mainstream economists on both the left center and right center and extreme right claimed they had solved the mystery of managing the macro economy up until really, Olivier Blanchard was saying it as late as 2008, a fellow I respect, but he represents a very large proportion, I think, of mainstream type thinking.
I might just mention that Olivier was a classmate of mine at MIT back in the mid-1970s.
There you go. I think that class, roughly, and Krugman told me the same thing.
Yeah, we were all there together.
Our public chat, everybody seemed to graduate in those
Ben Bernanke was around at that time, too.
Yeah, and was Rogoff?
Yeah, Ken Rogoff was also there. He was also a chess grandmaster. Did you know that?
I did know that,
yeah. He was a grandmaster when he was a graduate student.
Really? Yeah, a lot of these are, it's sort of a function of being precocious, I think.
Yeah, I guess.
And clearly he was precocious. Your class did all the damage, I'm teasing. Anyway, so that's one reason I wrote the book. Another reason is I believe lots of economic ideas literally led to the financial crisis of 2008. The first chapter, the introduction of the book is called Damage. Economists thought they had solved the problem. As proof, they offered up something called the Great Moderation, which noted the GDP was quite stable over this period, and they attributed that to inflation targeting, or at least targeting a low rate of inflation of 2% a year. And my third concern is these ideas are still alive and well, or not well, I would say. And the obvious example of that is the Fed's current arguments and over whether they should be raising interest rates when the inflation rate is not even 2%, the target they look at, the PCA, a deflator. So that's why I wrote the book, and I organized it according to Seven Bad Ideas, and the hub of it is really the invisible hand.
Yeah.
Did you want me to go over all seven now, Glenn?
Well, no, I don't think it's necessary. I think we'll probably get to it in the course of the conversation. And as you point out,
sure.
There's a kind of core, sort of intellectual cornerstone, as I understand your argument, which is captured by your objection to this idea called the invisible hand, attributed to Adam Smith. So you might talk a little bit about that. But before you do, if I could just put one thing on the table and hope that you'll be able to address yourself to it as we go along. Which is, as I was reading your book, I kept wanting to distinguish between ideas as such. On the one hand, ideas, theories of the macroeconomy, notions about regulation or the price system or whatever, on the one hand, and values on the other. How much I weigh the dangers associated with inflation vis-a-vis the cost to people attendant to unemployment, or how much I'm concerned about the profits and dividends paid to shareholders and firm owners on the one hand versus the status of the working people who are employed by them on the other. And so I was hoping that, we could, bear in mind that, an idea is one thing, and how that idea gets employed, I should say, in the formulation of policy on behalf of what is another. I don't know. Does that make any sense to you?
Okay. Yeah, it does. I agree there are values, but I do think that my objections are really based on the criteria that economists themselves draw up, which is, are they optimizing prosperity? And, I think distribution of income is part of that, for example, but I don't think these ideas, whatever one's values, are optimizing prosperity. I should say that these ideas have had their place in time. My argument is they become set in stone. They become rules of thumb that the profession has relied on and built complex quantitative models based upon that I just don't think apply adequately to the real world.
Okay, so let's talk about the invisible hand idea.
Well, I call it the beautiful idea. And like many beautiful things, it's too alluring to be true, and so alluring that it shuts out common sense. Now, I know every economist, almost every, let me call them mainstream economists, I think. What I mean by that is neoclassical economists, takes umbrage at my questioning the invisible hand, but I stand by it. It's not a matter of questioning the idea or the claim so much. It is a beautiful idea. It's a question of, my question is, does it really work? Does following our own self-interest without any intervention by government or any other force result through the process of the invisible hand in finding a price that distributes goods or services equitably and in the most prosperous way possible? I don't think it does work. Now, economists invariably say, well, we acknowledge there are frictions. And a recent economist who wrote about my book talked about Galileo's law of falling bodies. The feather and the brick will fall at the same rate to Earth from the Tower of Pisa if there were a vacuum. In other words, no air friction. My argument, however, is there are many, many frictions to the workings of the invisible hand. And indeed, I think it's even more than that. I think it's very hard to make the case that everybody is making a decision that comes together in some community good. I think the history of markets is much more institutional and less free market driven than economists believe. And where we see the example I always use is the minimum wage. Many economists are, and I think you're hesitant about raising the minimum wage, or at least raising it over a certain amount. Many economists argue we should not raise the minimum wage because it will lose jobs. Now, that's based on an invisible hand argument. As the price goes up, less. But empirical evidence, and we can disagree about the empirical evidence, but much empirical evidence shows it's just not the case. We don't lose jobs, or the jobs that are lost are minimal, and in some cases we even gain jobs. What do economists base their argument against raising the minimum wage? Is it empirical or is it ideological? Is it a firm faith in the invisible hand? That's why I bring up the invisible hand, and from that invisible hand argument stems my other 6 ideas that I'm concerned with.
Okay, let me weigh in a bit. Okay, so
of course,
here's how I understand the invisible hand idea as a professional economist. How it is that, if you will, I was trained to understand it. The modern way of stating Adam Smith's aphorism would be the claim, and we call it the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, that under certain conditions, the competitive equilibrium is Pareto efficient. Forgive me with the lingo, but I'm just trying to be precise in what this statement is. That is, under certain conditions, should the market reach an equilibrium point, and so that's a price for the goods with the property that demand and supply are just balanced in all the various markets. On the assumption that, and then there are a set of assumptions, there can't be any unpriced goods like pollution that are belching out of smokestacks and causing people health problems, but that the people who emit the pollution don't have to pay for the damage they do to others. We have to assume competitive behavior. So people are price takers, not price makers. They don't have monopoly power in the markets. We have to assume that there are not any increasing returns to scale. These are all technical requirements of this result. And there are others. But given these requirements, should one reach a balancing point of equilibrium in the marketplace at prices where demand and supply are balanced, then the outcome is efficient in a very restricted sense, in the sense that it's not possible to make everybody better off. If you make someone better off by changing the arrangement of things, someone else will have to have been made worse off in doing so. So that's the claim. Okay. So here's how I understand it. I certainly do not understand it, and you mentioned this, as a blanket condemnation of government interference with the market. Rather, I understand it as an idealized claim, and I accept the comparison to, physical mechanics and, a system where you assume there are no frictions and you have one account of what will happen, but in the real world, things may differ because frictions are everywhere. It's an idealization, and it, I think, does the intellectual work of asking of an analyst whenever they might want to intervene in some way to depart from, a free market environment, whenever they might want to regulate a price, whenever they might want to put up a tariff, whenever they might want to engage in a subsidy, and various other kinds of policies to justify that intervention in pointing out either how the conditions of this idealized claim fail in this particular instance, or arguing that notwithstanding the fact that we depart from a circumstance that would have been Pareto efficient, that's a very weak requirement, nevertheless, it's worthwhile for other reasons having to do with things that we value other than efficiency, to depart. So it works as a kind of intellectual discipline, as a framework for thinking, and as an accountancy, a way of kind of keeping track of what the benefits and costs associated with any particular policy proposal, the minimum wage being one of them, might be. I'd like to come back to the minimum wage, but I've talked for a bit, and I want to give you a chance to respond.
Well, here's my problem, Glenn.
Yeah.
Economists will say that. The fact is that even when Kenneth Arrow and DeBrew did this work on Pareto optimality, not long after World War II, and I'm a big fan of Kenneth Arrow.
Yeah.
The value of their work was to show how many assumptions one has to make for this to actually happen. And indeed, as Joe Stiglitz, a student of Kenneth Arrow, once told me,
sure,
Kenneth Arrow did made the point of Pareto optimality in some mathematical sense, proved it, and then spent the rest of his career showing that it never works. My argument is that while economists say they are aware of these assumptions and frictions, take rising economies of scale. Uh, what a huge exception that is in the invisible hand. But while they say it, they don't really practice it. They fall back on it. So the invisible hand becomes and became a justification for financial deregulation. That is, the markets would clear and efficiently, and we would wind up with a price for securities that was by and large, quote unquote, right. I think that was a reductio ad absurdum. But America practiced that. The Clinton administration said, let's not regulate derivatives. The argument goes back to something made made rather simply by Milton Friedman, which was his great talent to make things rather simple. I think when he was talking about floating currencies in the early 50s, he said, if the price is too high, somebody smart will sell it, and if it's too low, somebody smart will buy it. That's the argument. It just doesn't work that way. That's an invisible hand argument. And for me to use sort of the modern term, it's the default app of economists time and again. I hear you. You're eager to jump in here, I know. But we had deregulation. I make the same argument about inflation targeting. I think 2% inflation target is almost crazy, and what's going on.
Hold on. Let's do one thing at a time.
Now is pretty crazy. Sure.
Yeah. So I can remember when there were dozens of different prices at the wellhead for natural gas that was being produced in the United States because of an elaborate system of price regulation that was intended to protect consumers against high energy prices by ensuring that the producers of natural gas wouldn't get any more than what was necessary, and it varied depending on the geological and so forth, the cost structures of the production of the gas. Some gas needed higher prices than others, and there was an elaborate regulatory system that was designed to try to get these benefits for consumers. And I can remember when trucking in the United States was heavily regulated under the Interstate Commerce Commission, and where the truck would have to travel empty on the backhaul route because it didn't have authorization to carry the things, and so forth and so on. In other words, I can remember systems of regulation. I'm not now speaking about the financial regulation of trading in derivatives or about whether or not banks are permitted to engage in certain kinds of financial transactions on accounts that are protected by, federal insurance, or what kind of reserve requirements banks might be mandated through regulation to maintain in order to engage in certain kind of financial activities. I'm not talking about that, but I am talking about regulation. And I'm saying that an instinct that comes out of the economist worldview that, all right, we want to protect consumers, but what about the fact that when you hold down the price of natural gas, you change the incentives that producers have to produce it? All right, we want to make sure that people don't have to pay too much for rent in a city, but what about the fact if you legislate rent control, it affects the construction and the supply of housing? All right, so we want to give America a raise. We think that low-wage workers should be making more, but what about the fact that when we raise the price of that labor, there's some activities that no longer become economically viable, which otherwise would have been viable at the, quote, market wage, close quote. In other words, the instinct to ask these questions, to which the answer might be, never mind the incentives to the producers of natural gas. We want to keep the price to consumers low. The answer might be, we understand that there can be consequences for the structure of rental housing in the city. Nevertheless, we believe that rent control, taking from the landlords in effect and giving to the apartment dwellers, is the right move to make. Mindful of the consequences of having done so, we nevertheless elect to follow that path of departing from the market outcome. So I would say what we have here is a framework, an intellectual framework for thinking and accounting about what we do. Now, there can be some practitioners of the economic arts who adopt that framework in an ideologically blinkered manner and simply always come out on one side of the answer, where in effect they're substituting their values for analysis. But I don't think the framework of analysis should be indicted for the fact that some of its practitioners are ideologues.
Well, I do not make the case that all economists do a bad job, and I think you put it nicely. The problem is, I would like to say almost invariably, that very often what this framework leads to is an ideological answer, which is you don't have to regulate prices. I remember when oil went way up. Was it 2007, the summer of 2007? I won't name names, but some prominent liberal economists claim this has nothing to do with Wall Street speculation. This is merely a function of Chinese demand. Now, what did they base that argument on? Was there a way to seriously measure this, or was it simply an invisible hand assumption that speculation actually leads to stability, not instability? Similarly, with regulating the subprime market, or indeed trying to pop speculative bubbles. Bernanke, a very bright guy, a reasonable guy, said we can't pop speculative bubbles. In the last 30 to 40 years, these 7 ideas I'm talking about became very ideological. And I think the nature of the economics theory leads to that, because the idea of dealing with exceptions is very difficult. And it's kind of hard, I think, for economists to understand there may be multiple equilibria. Very hard notion to come to grips with. The invisible hand that we all know, our demand and supply curves, shows that there is one point at which equilibrium is reached. John Maynard Keynes' basic argument, and I think so ingrained is the invisible hand in modern thinking that modern prominent economists don't read Keynes accurately, or they read him a long time ago and think he said something he didn't say. He didn't say that a high level of unemployment becomes persistent because of market failures. He said it happens at an equilibrium point. I just read a book by Stiglitz and Greenwald about innovation, and they argue that there are multiple equilibria in the invisible hand. The neoclassical framework does not apply to an innovation economy. We can reach equilibria at high innovation, low innovation, medium innovation. Equilibria is not the issue. So my argument is we have you can call it an analytical tool, but it's not used analytically. Why is that?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's because it's not that useful. It's not that useful a tool.
It's
not a tool.
It's a profoundly useful tool. I object. And like I say, there are assumptions. So in this world of multiple equilibria, and there's nothing in the mechanics of the welfare theorems in economics that rules out multiple equilibrium. It says if we're at a competitive equilibrium, then. So there could be more than one, and there will be different outcomes and different distributions of benefits and burdens. But the efficiency criterion would presumably apply if the assumptions are true. But what I want to say is that you say it's a beautiful idea. It is a beautiful idea. Let's inquire to a minute about what's beautiful about it. Okay, so the, quote, remarkable, close quote, is the remarkable implication of this invisible hand idea is that a kind of coordination takes place without there being any direct control. It's that say I want lower emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Okay, so there are millions of points where emissions are taking place, from the automobile exhaust to the smokestack to the heating in the home and so forth and so on. Every one of them is different and has its own idiosyncratic character. If I announce that the price of carbon, and I have a way of monitoring how much carbon people are emitting, I have a way of charging them for the carbon that they emit. If I announce to them that the price of carbon is whatever, okay, I have a number, I have a price, and I impose that fee, then the coordination problem of which smokestack should be closed, of how much economizing on the consumption of fossil fuels should take place in what sectors of the economy, of how to balance off the various implications of there being a shift from, oil and natural gas to solar power and so on. That enormous coordination problem, we think, in principle, gets solved efficiently by people reacting to a common set of prices, which is an incredible improvement over the effort to administratively indicate to people through some kind of central activity and some kind of, environmental control center of one kind or another, what it is that they should do. So this, you say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you seem to say that, quote, it doesn't work, close quote. Well, that idea, that beautiful idea, absolutely does work. I mean, it's a logical idea that is an insight, into how it is that activities might be efficiently coordinated amongst a disparate number of agents.
Well, it's your hypothesis that it does work. I would say, what I'm trying to say, and we've seen it in the real world, and that's what my book is about. I'd say it is merely a hypothesis that actually doesn't work. There are way too many exceptions. There are way too many, let's call them PowerPoints, or ways of manipulating the market price. There are way too many issues that can be handled by, I'm not arguing for the most part for central planning.
How would you reduce the carbon emissions more efficiently than what it is that I just described?
I would like to see a carbon tax, but that doesn't mean that that there won't be lots of people paying penalties. But I would like to see a carbon tax. I don't disagree with that. But why were most economists? But let me ask you this. Let me ask you this, Glenn.
Yeah.
Why were so many economists in favor of deregulation? Why didn't economists shout that, wow, we're not taking all kinds of matters into that should be concerning the federal government into account? Why, when this bubble was crazy? And economists shout. They shout all the time about free trade. They've had enormous public influence in free trade. Why didn't they shout about all the conflicts of interest in Wall Street back then? All the potential for manipulation.
I think some did, Jeff.
All the hidden markets and the lack of transparency.
I think many did. The last time we talked about this, I mentioned my colleague Ross Levine, who's an economist at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. He used to be here at Brown. He has a book with a colleague called The Guardians of Finance. The book came out, I think, 2010 or so, maybe 2011, but the research on which it was based had been going on for some time. And Ross did, I mean, he's not alone amongst economists, but I take your point, though, that there were many. One thinks of Larry Summers as a very prominent economist who was at the Treasury Department during the Clinton administration when some of this deregulation took place.
And he's in many ways the best example.
Yeah.
Because, I call him a shapeshifter.
In any case, many economists did argue in more or less ideological terms that deregulation was the way to go. And I have to tell you, I don't know enough about the details of financial regulation to necessarily dispute the general claim that let's regulate, but let's regulate with caution and let's be aware of the benefits that are associated with financial innovation. That's the kind of thing that the deregulators are going to say.
Sure, that's a
but we have the benefit of hindsight, and we can see that the financial crisis of 2008 might have been avoided if people had been more assiduous about regulation. So I'm not disputing that at all. But the idea still works. Okay, the idea that which I tried to illustrate with the control of carbon emissions, the idea that using prices to coordinate the activities of millions of people and using markets is generally a more efficient way than trying to write a piece of legislation that puts numerical caps on what people can do or otherwise dictates their activities. Because we don't have the information. Information is decentralized. Information is disseminated amongst many centers of decision-making. So centralized action in the absence of that information often is efficient, but decentralized action responsive to prices often is. This is an insight. It may or may not apply in every particular case, but the insight is deeply
but listen to me, Glenn. Yeah, sure. That's the theory and that's the proposal. That's the proposition of mainstream economics. And when you get to the real world, how are we going to determine? Do we really think that prices? Can we really make a claim that prices should be efficient and setting markets in an efficient in an efficient way. Did it happen in finance? Did it happen in running the economy? We had an unemployment rate. Why did we have an unemployment rate that was two-thirds or three-quarters of the time above the estimated natural rate of unemployment by the CBO since the early 1980s? Something was misapplied. I mentioned to you in past conversations that this idea of inflation targeting is highly dependent on an invisible hand approach to the market, which is to say almost all we have to worry about is getting inflation out of the way, and this general equilibrium, this Pareto optimality idea that you talk about, will then take over and the market will work very efficiently.
We're talking past each other here. You're talking about macroeconomic instability and unemployment and Keynes and all of that, aggregate demand management and all of that, inflation, unemployment trade-off. I'm talking about microeconomic coordination of, the decisions of people in particular markets where I'd like to see prices have their sway. I'd like to, if I want to help renters, I'd like to give them subsidies, not to hold the price of apartments down.
But Glenn, as you know, this is an old argument, and the price argument was the very argument made in deregulating finance. We would suppress innovation if we regulated it. They know what they're doing. They're pros. They're not going to make dumb decisions, and allowing the markets to run free will work well. I mean, we have the best case example of the world. And let me just finish this point. Olivier Blanchard said specifically, and now in a kind of mea culpa, there was no place for financial regulation in our macro models, and macro models are now micro models, as you well know. So that's been the big transformation since Robert
picking a comment, Jeff. What Olivier must have meant, I don't know the quote exactly, but I can imagine what he was saying is that if you look at the state of macroeconomic modeling, no one has yet figured out successfully how to put finance into a macro model. I think that's true.
That's absolutely wrong. That is not what he was saying. What he was saying is nobody even thought that macro regulation should be part of the model.
I think that's the same point.
No, it's not the same point. You're saying nobody figured out how to do it. This is very important.
I assure you,
that's not what he said.
We don't
He's
know how
saying
to do it.
nobody,
somebody will get a Nobel Prize for that.
Nobody thought it was important enough. Why? Invisible hand, and that's my point. You can make all the idealistic claims about the use of the invisible hand. When it gets to the real world, economists, by and large, throw in the towel and say the invisible hand works, prices are setting. And we have now countless sad examples of the recent economy. And it just wasn't the crisis of 2008. It was very poor performance until then. High inequality. These guys were talking about a great moderation.
It has nothing to do with the invisible hand, Jeff.
You argued that in our past conversation, and you're entirely wrong. It was an invisible hand argument. Get the economy stable, get inflation out of the way. Read Ben Bernanke's book with co-authors on inflation targeting. He says specifically, then the economy will work efficiently, meaning we have this general equilibrium theory that goes back to Valra and others. Let it work. It was clearly an invisible hand idea and a very sad one. And you can deny it all you like, but look at the book. Look how clearly he states it in the book.
I just think we're name calling here. I said what I think the invisible hand idea. Excuse me, let me finish. I said what I think the invisible hand idea is. It is that under certain conditions, competitive equilibria are Pareto efficient, a very restricted idea. I said what work I thought it did intellectually. It gave a framework that allowed people to think about the consequences of various kind of interventions in the market. I said there are some economists who are ideologues and who fall back on the invisible hand. But, I said, that would not be a fair representation either of the idea or of the role that it plays within the profession. And then I gave numerous examples of concrete markets. They are micro markets. You want to talk about finance, inflation and unemployment and so forth, where I think, the state of economic understanding just about what's going on. I mean, Keynes was 80 years ago, The state of understanding about what's going on in the market, in the economy, is weak. We don't really understand the ebb and flow of unemployment, inflation, and so forth and so on. And where I think the invisible hand idea, as I understand it, doesn't apply directly. But, so I've just restated my position. And as you say, maybe we should.
And then let me just take 2 sentences to restate.
Yeah, okay, fine.
The big example of the failure of the invisible hand is precisely the financial markets. There are others. It's the failure of inflation targeting, which I spell out in the book. So one can argue that in an ideal world, the invisible hand has some use. My argument is that it is a highly abused idea, and and economists fall back on it all the time. Financial regulation was the clear example.
Okay, so we restated our ideas. I don't think they're consistent with one another. So let's talk about something else in your book. Another bad idea. I want to claim that economics is a science in a very restricted way. I think one of your bad ideas is the idea that economics is a science. And obviously you can expand on this. I want to claim, in the spirit of what I have been saying so far, that even if I were to decide that I wanted to regulate financial markets, or I didn't quite like the high rate of return that some investors were getting with certain kinds of transactions, or I wanted to protect domestic workers from competition offshore, or whatever, even if I were to decide that, the implementing an effective policy that could achieve my goals at least cost would require me to delve deeply into the scientific toolkit of economists. It would require me, in terms of empirical assessment, in terms of looking out at the world, collecting data and analyzing it, to frame my activity with the theories of economists, and in terms of interpreting whatever it is that I might observe empirically, and in terms of calibrating whatever intervention I might want to engage in, I would need to repair to the models and the thinking of economists. So that at the end of the day, even the person who's dead set against free marketeerism is ultimately dependent upon the ideas and the workings of economic analysis in order to be able to intervene effectively. So economics is a science, although in a restricted sense.
Well, your position seems to be all about restricting these definitions and then claiming how useful it is. We can't tell. When most people, when they think of a science, think of it as coming up with provable ideas, proved by empiricism, and that will work clearly under universal conditions, or almost universal conditions, or at least in defined conditions that are very broad and very wide. Economics just doesn't fit the bill. Economics can't really tell you, though, I think, whether big government will restrain growth or will help growth. I think that one resorts to empirical data to determine that, but that's not economic theory, and I think Peter Linder did that pretty well.
Data
but
don't speak for themselves.
The economists will resort to the same empirical data. They don't really use the same empirical data and argue exactly the opposite. Or let me take another example, because my argument is these tools you think are so wonderful are not adequate to the task. Too many factors affect economic growth. These are the arguments.
These tools are all we got.
In the book. So
they're all we got, Jeff.
Well, then that's not good enough. That's the old, the old joke about
economists. Then,
the old joke about economists and the lamp, looking under the lamppost. You use what you got. No, you have to recognize that what you got is limited, and it's not a good enough answer.
Let me give an example. We're still working on it. There used to be something called Marxian economics a long time ago. There used to be something called Marxian economics. Everybody has abandoned it, no matter whether they're left, right, or center. And the reason they abandoned it is because it proved not to be useful for analyzing data.
But there used to be something much more powerful in the economics profession called institutional economics, and I'm very sad that was abandoned in mainstream.
Well, they call it economic sociology nowadays. It's still being practiced, just not within economics departments.
It's so denigrated by professional economics.
I agree. I actually agree with that.
It's not equally good.
And also historical economics. Economic history isn't studied and practiced very much anymore. In a
Absolutely.
Way that I agree with that.
How can you figure out what's going on with this financial problem we've got without studying economic history? It's impossible, but they'll tell you they can do it. They'll tell you time and again. I don't think you can. How do you determine what caused and reinforced the Industrial Revolution, or without obviously looking back at economic history, but do modern tools really tell you what created the Industrial Revolution? Read the histories of the Industrial Revolution.
Well, Jeff,
you'll rarely find a mention
I have to
of
say
the
this.
invisible hand.
I have to say this because I'm in a department here at Brown that has some of the leading practitioners of this. David Weil, my colleague, is one of them. Odette Gallor, my colleague, is another one. Stelios Mikalopoulos, my colleague, is yet a third. They're all here at Brown. Do they have the answer to where the Industrial Revolution comes from in some grand sense? No, but they are definitely hard at work on trying to use real historical data, not only about the industrial economies in Europe and North America, but also in the developing world, to understand the dynamics, the processes of technical innovation, of market diffusion, of demographic transformation, and all the rest that are associated with, the economic modernity, with Well,
here we completely agree, Glenn. I mean, I close my book saying we need to use, we have to, economists have to search all of these various fields. They can't only stick with narrow neoclassical models, but I think a lot of them are much more comfortable doing so. So people will make very hard pronouncements about how big government, very unambiguous pronouncements about how big government will retard economic growth. They don't say, maybe it will. They don't. Robert Barrow and Martin Feldstein don't say, maybe.
Well, yeah, Robert
They
Barrow,
say it does.
And here am I. Sure, I mean those guys are notorious marketeers.
They're very influential economists, and they.
Well, they are because let me take Barrow as an example. I want to take Robert Barrow as an example. So he's a guy who has argued. I don't think I distort in saying this. That don't worry. Government can't really have an impact on the real economy through expansionary monetary policy because if it borrows in order to spend, those debts will ultimately accrue to individuals as tax liabilities because the government has to repay them and the government doesn't do anything except tax. That's where its money comes from. Anticipating the future tax liability, people will reduce their spending today, thinking ahead. And therefore, when the government borrows in order to increase aggregate demand, the net effect is zero because there's an offsetting economizing behavior on the part of people. So he's argued this. Okay, so the idea is called neutrality. Okay? So it doesn't work. I think you might be quick to say. Many others have said it.
Ricardian.
It's a Ricardian equivalence idea, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work in the sense that it's not borne out empirically that the net effect of government borrowing is zero. On the other hand, thinking about how government action subtly influences private behavior. For example, can the government fool all the people all the time? It does something that we didn't expect today, but having done so, it alters the way in which we calculate our expectations in the future. Or that there's no free lunch. I mean, that's another economic aphorism, comes from the invisible hand, but it's also true, at least it's true in a tautological sense. If I push on the balloon over here, the pressure is going to come out over there. If I want to benefit somebody over here, the money doesn't fall from heaven. There will be consequences over there. And Barrow's innovation, while perhaps not something that I would want to rely on to predict the consequence of government action, is still intellectually very valuable in leading me to think in more subtle and complex ways about the unanticipated consequences of government action. I think that's an insight.
The argument, I think you're getting small bore here.
Oh, sorry.
I think you present narrow examples, and rather than looking at this difficult history we've had for 30 or 40 years of trying to manage an economy, trying to deal with inequality, trying to wonder why CEOs get so much money, which I argue is partly an invisible hand, efficient markets theory result. So much money for why are companies manage for the short run? Inflation targeting. Why are we so? Haven't we given up? Haven't we given up jobs in order to keep inflation low? These are the big issues involving America. Are there economists who do their job well? I think I know a few. I think so. In fact, I dedicated the book to economists who do the job well. But the big issues The big issues are driven by these ideas I'm talking about.
Let me respond,
policy issues.
I'm still going to be small ball if, in your view, probably, but I want to talk about executive compensation for a minute, because this is the point that I would make, and it would not be to defend the CEOs getting 1,000 times what their average worker gets or 600 times or whatever. It would be to say, if I think that, so here's what this, I'm sorry, let me just organize my thought. Here's what the standard textbook kind of free market economics response would be. Well, why would the company pay them what they're not worth? It must be that they're worth it because they're being paid it. Okay, and I grant you that that response is inadequate for exactly the reasons that you stated. It assumes a conclusion. It assumes that the outcome, because it has come about by quote, a market, close quote, is the right outcome. What I would say is, looks like when I look at other countries, Japan, Western Europe, whatever, I don't see anything like this outsized executive compensation. It's implausible that these guys are that much more productive than, you know, the next one over or than the line worker. Therefore, should their compensation be sustained at an ultra high level, I've got to ask myself the question, what is impeding the hypothetical market process that would compete that salary down? So now I start looking at corporate governance. Now I start looking at interlocking boards of directors. Now I start looking at the extent to which the compensation process is protected from the consequences of market competition that otherwise ought to have ensued. So I still get value out of the invisible hand framework, even if I don't apply it like an ideologue, because it shows me where to look to understand the phenomenon that I'm observing.
I doubt you need the invisible hand to think about the power of CEOs and the control of their boards of directors and the lack of power of shareholders. My point about CEO compensation was that there was the huge, what they thought was an extraordinary revolution for a while, led by Chicago, but to some degree MIT, where CEOs would be compensated with stock options. And the stock price, because it was right, quote unquote, would be a measure of how well they managed the company. So they made a market argument. And that market argument, by and large, prevailed. Now, I think it prevailed partly because it was so beneficial to the powers that be, but that was their market argument. And the market argument depended on an invisible hand argument, which was that financial markets are so efficient that the stock price correctly reflected the future value of a company. That's what prevailed for quite a long time. I think we had a couple of market crashes which suggested that wasn't the case, but CEOs are still getting whopping stock options, so something else is going on here. I don't think you need the invisible hand to talk about power. I don't think the invisible hand helps one bit.
I tell you this, my friend Jeff, I tell you this. If you can spot a market in which the stock price doesn't reflect the value of the company, if you can spot it, if you can identify it, you can make a lot of money. Okay, that's the arbitrage idea, also a cousin of the invisible hand, right?
Yeah.
If there's a gap between value and price, there's an incentive for somebody to get into the business, buy low and sell high, and make a lot of money. That's what's driving market to equilibrium in the economic textbooks.
So there should never be bubbles, Glenn.
Well, no.
Come on. You just said there shouldn't be bubbles.
No. To the extent that there are bubbles, something is impeding, whether it's a flow of information, whether it's a lack of access to capital, whether it's some kind of market power, some kind of insider activity going on. Something is impeding the arbitrage process because everybody wants money. When people walk down the street and they see dollar bills lying on the sidewalk, they tend to bend over and pick them up. And when they see gaping disparities between value and price, they tend to narrow that gap by buying or selling accordingly. So this is just true, it would seem to me, but we're back to square one here. I'm an economist.
Forgive me if this sounds crude, but here's the brainwashing of the invisible hand. The invisible hand would work except there are impediments. Well, of course there are impediments. But in the case of stocks, when the invisible hand suggests, and you can draw the curves differently, of course, for every exception, this is one of the weaknesses of economics. You can account for any exception in retrospect. But the invisible hand suggests when a price goes up, you should want less of it. In the financial markets, it's very often the opposite. When the price goes up,
sure, because
it
people
suggests
anticipate
this
future
is
price. People
this
think the
is
price
a
rising
hot
today is
item.
a signal of the price rising in the future. So
Right, that's a hot item, and that's what drives speculative bubbles. And then you
it
make
is.
stories
And what do you want
about
to do
them,
about
and
it?
they're crazy stories. But that's not an invisible. You don't analyze that with the invisible hand. The invisible hand is useless in that respect, unless you make some crazy
No, I
adjustment
don't
to it
think
with
so, Jeff.
curves going the other way.
I just
Yeah,
think.
I mean, this is talking about minor issues, small bore issues.
Hold on,
We
hold
have
on, hold
such
on.
big issues to discuss.
Okay, so we're going to have to conclude here because my time's running out.
Yeah.
I just want to say I don't think I don't agree with the last thing that you said. And let's talk about speculation and talk about price going up and how much people demand and what their expectations are. So true, bubbles can happen, and true, some simplistic theories don't allow for bubbles because they don't allow for this kind of dynamism. They don't allow for this kind of Ponzi-like activity where, if I think other people think that something's going to be of more value tomorrow than today, then buying it now affords me the opportunity to make a profit. A lot of people could think like that. That can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It can go on for some time. Everybody thinks the price of housing is going to be higher tomorrow than it was today. Price seems to be way out of line with the fundamentals. But so long as we're right in thinking that others are thinking, this makes sense. That's a complicated, dynamic, interdependent world of coordinated expectation. It's very difficult to analyze it. But the tools that I would bring to try to analyze it would be no different than the tools that I would employ in a more straightforward exercise of the invisible hand. That is, I would assume people are self-interested and that they're trying to maximize their well-being. I would assume that they act in that pursuit of that on the basis of the information that's available. I would assume that prices tend to move to balance off supply and demand for the reasons that we all know. I would employ invisible hand-like thinking, even in the interest of trying to understand a tulip mania or trying to understand a financial bubble that can, in housing or in securities that could burst at any moment.
We seriously disagree. That's a stretch. That's an invisible hand. You don't need an invisible hand to know that people are buying because it's a fashion. We didn't need an invisible hand to talk about the madness of crowds. And the invisible hand, in fact, argued the other way, to take Milton Friedman's argument. You can't have a speculative bubble because smart people would sell. The invisible hand works. Competition works.
And what I'm saying...
unregulated markets work.
What I'm saying
we needed
is when it gets down to fashioning a piece of legislation, or when it gets down to actually trying to regulate one of these things, to try to put a cap on something, to try to restrict what transactions can take place, when it gets down to analyzing what the effects, cost, and benefits will be of this or that proposal, we're ultimately going to be right back to the Economist toolkit.
Okay. Does it really help you to talk about how we might need higher capital requirements so these people can't speculate as much? I don't think so.
Well, I don't know what the capital requirement should be. Should it be 5%, 10%, or 30%? And what's the consequence of moving it from 20 to 30? That's the kind of question that I'm talking about.
Invisible hand argued that we didn't need it because the market would take care of it, just like Milton Friedman
I didn't say that.
30, 40 years ago.
No, I didn't say that. I said even if you don't want to let the market take care of it, in order to figure out what to do, you're going to ultimately end up back in the economist world doing the kind of analysis based on the kind of assumptions that we want to make.
I'm afraid, Glenn, I think that's kind of a bit of sophistry. We don't need the invisible hand to be with us.
Okay, well, Jeff, you're talking to Professor of Economics,
we have to agree
Glenn
to
Loury,
differ.
And you've written a book about why economist ideas are destroyed, are bad for the world. So you can expect that we were going to conclude this conversation on a note of disagreement, and it seems we've managed to do that.
Okay, thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Take care.
Bye.